Hello, my name is Andrew Bahari, and I'm a deacon at the Coptic Orthodox Church. And what I'll be doing in this video is I'll be making a case for why Orthodoxy will end up being Americanized. And that, of course, applies to Orthodoxy in the United States of America. And then I'll talk about whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing, what it really means, what this is all about. And the way I'll be doing this is I'll be taking a historical approach. I'll be talking about the relevant history of the country, and I'll be using that history to inform the future. And while it's true that history does not repeat itself, history does indeed rhyme. And so you often hear it said that America is the land of immigrants. And while that's sort of true, it doesn't really tell the whole picture. Because America, first and foremost, before being a land of immigrants, is a land of settlers. And as many of you know, the earliest history of what is now known as the country of the United States of America really started when the settlers, who were British, they were often people who were disenfranchised with the monarchy. They were disenfranchised with the British Queen and King. They were disenfranchised with Catholicism. And so they wanted this religious freedom. And so they left Great Britain to come and settle the United States of America. And of course, there were Native Americans who existed on the land natively before the arrival of the settlers. The country wasn't really colonialized. I always struggle with this word, colonialized, until the settlers came. And so these initial settlers who came from Britain to establish this new colony, which ultimately became its own country, till this day, that culture, that religion, and those people really permeate and compromise what makes up the heart of what is America, what is Americanism, and what is American culture, right? America has this underlying current of Protestantism. It has this underlying current of the culture that was brought over from the original settlers, the British Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? WASPs, sometimes they're called. And what happened a little bit later, around the 1940s, is the Catholics started immigrating en masse to the United States of America. This was mostly Irish. This was, to some extent, Germans. And there was this great potato famine over in Ireland. And so you had a lot of these immigrants coming over around the 1840s to kind of get away from that hardship that they were experiencing over in Ireland. And when the Catholics first came to America, keep in mind, the original settlers, the Protestant settlers, went to America to get away from what they perceived to be the tyranny of the monarchy and the tyranny of Catholicism, of the Pope. And so when the Catholics started coming over in large quantities, there was massive prejudice to the Catholics from the Protestants. They did not like them. You even had signs in front of places of employment that said Irish need not apply here, right? And so a lot of the original settlers were really skeptical of the Catholics. They were worried whether or not the Catholics were really loyal to the Pope or whether they were loyal to America. And so this was something that kind of came to fruition over time. And what happened was eventually Catholicism in America started becoming Americanized. It started becoming Protestantized. And the way that is church attendance in Catholic churches has drastically decreased, kind of to match what is typical of the Protestant demographic. And a lot of people kind of perceive themselves as being culturally Catholic in many of the same ways that people in America perceive themselves to be culturally Protestant. This is kind of part of my heritage, part of my identity. And while it's a faith, it's kind of not a faith that I'm engaging in in a consistent manner, in a deep manner, right? Maybe I'll go to church on Sundays, Easter, really just Easter Sunday and Christmas, maybe. And of course, the Catholic Mass, has changed drastically in many parts of America to kind of match what is known as the Novus Ordo, which is the new Mass in the Catholic Church, where things have become a bit more Protestantized, where if you observe a Orthodox liturgy or, a traditional Latin Mass in the Catholic Church, it resembles more formal prayer. There's a lot more reverence, but in a lot of, not all, okay? So in one of my other videos about Catholicism, I mentioned the Novus Ordo, and people are like, oh, well, not all Novus Ordo churches are really that irreverent. And that's true, right? A lot of Novus Ordo churches still retain a lot of the elements that exist from the traditional Latin Mass, but there has been this shift of it being a bit more in general, right? About engaging with the congregation and the congregation engaging with each other, as opposed to it being the entire congregation kind of oriented and fixated up in prayer. And one of the most obvious ways this is observed is in the Orthodox liturgy, traditional Latin Mass. Typically, you have the priest facing away from the congregation, and they're looking up to the heavens and praying. While in a lot of the Novus Ordo Masses, the priest is facing the people. So, this is the Protestantization that has kind of occurred to Catholicism, both liturgically as well as culturally. And what's also happened really since the beginning of the inception of America as a country is you experience this erosion of ethnicity. And when people were originating from the countries that they came from, their countries of origin, you had Irish, and you had Germans, and you had Poles, and of course you had Brits. And what happened due to a lot of interracial marriages is, or I should rather say interethnic marriages, is that there was this erosion of ethnicity, where these places of origin, whether it's Ireland or Britain or Germany or Poland or wherever else, kind of, these immigrants kind of related to this heritage as a critical part of their identity. Once all of this interracial, or rather interethnic marriage occurred, there was no longer that sense of ethnic heritage that was remained and retained by your average white American. And that's where we get the term white. What is white? This is new. This is kind of relative to America, because prior to white as a racial category, it was, like I said, British and Irish and German and Slavic and whatever else. But because of this situation where you have, your average white American who is maybe 1/8 Polish, 1/8 German, 1/2 Irish, so on and so on. They're this gigantic mix. They no longer kind of have that association, that cultural pull, that pull of identity towards ethnicity. And so we come up with white, this kind of blanket term, to cover this race of men that exists in America. And it's really broad. I am considered white in America because I'm Egyptian, and people from North Africa are considered white. It is what it is, right? And so while that's been the case, and while there was this intermingling of ethnicity, what actually was primarily retained during the few centuries that constitute American history is a clinging to religion. So while people might marry interethnically, they typically do not marry across denomination. Catholics most often marry other Catholics. Protestants most often marry other Protestants. This is what has happened. And so we still retain, these categories that remain mostly separated from one another, with the demographics being about 40% Protestant people in America, about 21% Catholic, right? And then there's about 19% who are non-affiliated, and then the rest is everyone else, right? And so while we've seen this sort of mixing of ethnicity, we have not seen as much mixing, much less mixing in religion. And that makes sense because things like ethnicity, skin color, all the stuff is surface level deep compared to the really significant aspects of our identity, which is our faith, right? Our religion. It's the most important thing, the most important part of our identity. It dictates how we are to live our entire lives, moment to moment. And so while the first early settlers started coming over around the 16th century, and the mass Catholic immigration really happened in the 19th century, you had the Eastern Orthodox start coming over primarily around the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And this was Russians, Balkans, Greeks, so on and so on. And they still constitute a much, much smaller percentage of overall Americans. I mentioned that Protestants are 40%, Catholics are 21%. Eastern Orthodox are only a few percentage points. I don't know off the top of my head right now. It's somewhere between 2 to 4%. And now we have a situation where what happened with the Catholics and how Catholicism became Americanized is not something that happened to much in the same extent to Eastern Orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox are not assimilating in much in the same way that the Catholics assimilated into American culture, which is categorized by its British roots, by its Protestant roots. And because of this, actually, it's created a situation where a lot of Westerners are timid to join the Eastern Orthodox Church. You've seen videos on the internet where people will say the reason why I'm not Orthodox is because to be Orthodox means to be ethnic, it means to be a Greek, it means to be a Serb, it means to be a Russian. And I'm a Western man. This is what people will say. And so that's why I'm not joining the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's why I'm going to go be Roman Catholic, for example, if I was initially secular or if I was Protestant or whatever. And you'll hear people say this quite a bit actually over in the West, that I can't join the Orthodox Church, whether it's the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Oriental Orthodox Church, because those churches are ethnic. And so this sort of, inculcating, this sort of cocooning of the Orthodox churches, whether it's Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox, has really created that situation. Now, of course, converts do come and join these churches, but there is a timidity there that we ought to recognize. And there is an exception to this, right? There is something called the Orthodox Church of America. And this is a subsect of the Eastern Orthodox Church that kind of broke off from ROKOR, which is the Russian Orthodox Church in America. And the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, is still primarily influenced by Russia and the Russian culture because it was kind of something that developed from ROKOR. And so while the OCA kind of has developed to some extent its own identity, it is, a bit more, it's perceived to be, at least, a bit more Americanized than the church it originated from. It's still primarily something that is heavily Russian inspired. And while it probably does lower that bar of timidity that some people feel, falsely, I may add, this is a bit of a tangent here, but I may add, a lot of Westerners might say, oh, well, Orthodoxy is exotic. It's not really part of what my heritage is. That's not true, because Orthodoxy is the original church that the apostles established. And there were great saints, such as Hilary of Poitiers. There were Orthodox churches that existed in the first few centuries of the church. And so it really is, in a lot of cases, the European heritage prior to Catholicism, prior to Eastern Orthodoxy, prior to Protestantism. And so, this kind of hang up that this is not really something that, or this faith isn't really something that is affiliated with my heritage is, first of all, false. And second of all, who cares? If it's true, it's true. But that's a tangent. That's a conversation for another time. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about in this video. And so the latest, really, group of immigrants I want to discuss, of course, is the Oriental Orthodox, because the Oriental Orthodox really started picking up their immigration to North America and the United States around the 1970s. And so we now have this sort of rich history of America being founded by the Protestants, and then the Catholics coming, and then the Eastern Orthodox coming, and now here we are. And so what can this history kind of inform us of where the Oriental Orthodox Church is going to be in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years in America? And what I predict is the case is that the Oriental Orthodox Church in many ways will mirror the Eastern Orthodox Church, in which it'll retain, in many ways, its ethnic origins. There will be the Coptic Church of America, there will be the Armenian Church in America, so on and so on. But I do also believe that there will eventually become this Oriental Orthodox Church of America that will develop. And the reason why I think this is the case is because studies have shown, research has indicated that the smaller the minority in a country, in a place, the higher the rates of interracial marriages are. And just from my own anecdotal experience, when I go to church and I engage with my community, there's probably more people I notice marrying people who are not ethnically Egyptian like I am, not ethnically Coptic, and they are marrying people of other races, from Indian races, Filipino races, white American races, right? My brother-in-law is fully German. He's a convert to the Coptic Orthodox Church. And so this is rather frequent. And when that happens, of course, what is people have kids. And when people have kids, they're now, hypothetically 1/4 Egyptian, 1/2 German, and maybe 1/4 whatever, right? So like 1/4 Egyptian, 1/4 Polish, and half German. So this person does not have that same pull to the Egyptian heritage that someone like I might have, who's 100% Egyptian ethnically. I was born and raised in America. I'm American. America is my home. I've spent maybe 2 months of my life cumulatively ever in Egypt. And so it's not like I even identify with the current culture that exists in Egypt, but I do identify with that long heritage, the thousands of years of heritage, right? Someone who has a lot more interracial mixing might not have that sort of, identification with that heritage. And so, as this continues to happen, and then those kids have kids, and then those kids have kids, you are going to have a lot of people who are no longer tied to Armenia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, India, Egypt, Syria, right? That's what's going to happen. And so then when you have the situation, and also literally just yesterday, I was watching a live stream where there was this Oriental Orthodox overall liturgy done with representatives from all the Oriental Orthodox churches. I think that was happening in America. I think it was in New Jersey. And so you're already seeing in America this sort of, unity amongst the Oriental Orthodox churches that didn't really need to occur in much of the same ways in these ethnic areas, right? So we're living in this new milieu. And so as this continues to happen, as we continue to communicate with each other more, get to know each other more, attend each other's churches, and, sometimes I see Eritrean people in my church. Sometimes I see Ethiopian people in my church, and it's a Coptic church. This happens, right? And of course, converts. I see converts in my church, usually, what appear to be Anglo-Saxon converts. And so, not everyone's going to have that Egyptian heritage, that, I cling to, that I love so much. I love my heritage. I love my hymns. I love the Coptic language, all of this stuff. But as the generations go on, it seems to be that this is going to be less and less the case. Now, there will always be those, and this is why I think, for example, the Eastern Orthodox Church has retained in large part its ethnic heritage. There will always be people who are Egyptian who are going to marry Egyptians, who are going to have Egyptian kids, who are going to marry Egyptians, so on and so on, right? But then we also do have this really rather large group of people who are marrying interracially and are having, these interracial children. And as we saw earlier, while the European ethnicities kind of intermingled in America to generate what is often categorized as the white race, which I'm, funnily enough, also part of. As an Egyptian, I'm classified as white in America. They mostly retained their religious heritage, and this religious heritage was something that was passed on from generation to generation, and marriages kind of still existed within these religious confines. I think that'll be the case for us, and there's always going to be this group of people who are going to be taken in to the fold of American secularism. And I think this is also in part because a lot of the Oriental Orthodox immigrants from all of these other countries usually move to urban cities, whether it's Los Angeles or New Jersey or Chicago or Mississauga up in Canada or whatever, right? They tend to immigrate to these urban areas, which are often a lot more liberal, a lot more secularized, a lot more atheistic in general, non-affiliated. And so I've noticed, myriad of the peers that I grew up with in church, myriad Oriental Orthodox, stop going to church. I think this is especially true of the millennial generation, the late Gen Z generation. And so there will be those people who will just go off and do their own thing, right? And that's going to happen. But for those who retain the faith and retain the sort of religiosity of their heritage, will continue to have kids, and then those kids, some of them will be lost at fault, some of them will be religious, just like anywhere else. And then, there will be this passing down of religion through the generations. And the Orthodox will continue to marry Orthodox for the most part, unless there are some of the people who, like I said, have kind of apostatized. And so what are the dangers of this? What are the sort of things we need to look out for during this process? And the big thing we need to look out for, of course, is the challenge of westernization, where the church might adopt, and, God forbid this happens, or, certain individuals might come to suggest the adoption of things like the Enlightenment presuppositions. And what those are, essentially, the big one is that the only thing we know to be true for certain is reason and logic, and then we kind of deduce truth and everything else from that starting point. Whereas, of course, as Orthodox, that's not what we believe. We believe the only thing we know for certain is God, not reason. God. And then everything is revealed to us from there. These sorts of things, that is a very Western idea, this Enlightenment presupposition of the ultimacy, the ontological ultimacy of reason. And another thing that, might be an issue in the future are mythological interpretations of things like Genesis, where, Genesis was a myth. This is something that Jordan Peterson likes to push all the time. And so then whether or not Darwinism is true or not doesn't really matter, because, maybe Genesis is a myth, so we can adopt that, this sort of stuff. This sort of Americanization is something that we may have to look out for in the future, to guard against, to allow Orthodoxy to retain its orthodoxy. And, I'm not really concerned about this overall, because Christ says to Peter in the Gospels, he says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So heretics will come, heretics will go, but the church will remain forever.